Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's lecture. We're so honored and really excited to have Aimee Allison with us. She's the founder of She the People, and I'm going to say more about Aimee in just one second. Before I do, I just wanted to share a little bit of a kind of a follow-up from our conversation on Monday. I mentioned that while we were in class, tipped workers were on strike in New York and Chicago. And I just wanted to share a little bit of news from that strike. So you can just see what happened. Can you see my screen and can you hear it?
$8 wage gap between Black women and white men on the typical city dining floor. And the difference largely due to lower tips. The employees say working for sub-minimum wages, even with tips, doesn't guarantee a fair and livable salary.
Fair labor. This is the thing in the United States that we're all trying to work on. We have to pay people for their labor. This is a discussion that we'll continue to have as we're stepping up into the streets and saying, hey, wait a minute, I'm not going to work for free.
In New York, a law banning sub-minimum wages was passed last year, but service industry employers are only required to pay a portion of the wage if the rest can be made up with tips.
So they went on strike on Monday, and about 100 employers responded by announcing that they're moving to a full minimum wage, and we're honoring those employers tomorrow. So it's already having some impact, but this is happening month after month. I just wanted to share real time what's happening in our world. Strikes happened in Chicago and New York on Monday, and then every month more and more cities are being added. So that's one of the context of our world, right? Women of color are earning a lot less than everybody else, but they're also going to be one of the most important, powerful forces in this coming election. That is one of the many kind of paradoxes that is the context of this election. So Professor Cohen and I couldn't think of a better person to start us off this semester thinking about what is the context of this particular election? Why is it so different? Why is it so historic than Aimee Allison? And I want to share another little video of Aimee recently on CNN. So let me switch to that and share that with you. So Aimee's been on television a lot recently, talking about the importance of women of color in this election, particularly leading up to a women of color being named for the first time in US history, vice presidential candidate on a major party ticket. So let's watch Aimee on CNN. Can you hear this? Sound.
To run. Look, we've been organizing. Do you think her presence will galvanize other women to speak up in their communities to run? Look, we've been organizing not only Black women, but Asian American and Latina and Indigenous women all over the country. The answer in a word is yes. There's an historic number of women of color who are running for Senate and Congress as well as down ballot. And Kamala Harris's presence at the top of the ticket is an indication and an affirmation of our political power. I have to say, though, for Trump, women of color are his kryptonite. We saw through him when he was running in 2016. We have been the subject of attacks, Latinas and Black women. There's a fancy word for it, misogynoir, which is the specialty that Trump has, the racist and sexist attacks. He's unleashed another wave of birtherism that we saw, this op-ed in Newsweek questioning whether Kamala Harris even belongs. The question, you know what? I'm sitting in Oakland, California. She was born in my hometown. She is as American, the American leader that we need right now. And so for women of color, we've seen this playbook. We know how to respond, and we recognize that Trump is really throwing red meat
to his supporters, hoping that racism is going to get him out to the polls. But I tell you what, women of color will do a lot to face the pandemic, unemployment, and all the problems to cast our vote in historic numbers. And we have to start by pushing back and not tolerating one word of the racist and sexist language that we see being leveled against Kamala Harris and the other women of color who are on the ballot in November.
Great. So a little bit of background about Aimee. She is a dear friend and colleague, but she's also an extraordinary person.
Do you think her presence will galvanize other women to
who has,
speak up in their communities?
Here we go. Who has done so much over the course of her career. So just want to tell you a little bit about Aimee, a little bit of background. She's the founder and president of She the People, which is a national network elevating the voice and power of women of color. She brings together voters, organizers, and elected leaders in a movement grounded in values of love, justice, belonging, and democracy. In 2018, Ms. Allison was one of the primary architects of the Year of the Women of Color in politics, which really began in 2018, but nobody can deny that this has been one of the most extraordinary years for women of color. In April 2019, she convened the first presidential forum for women of color, reaching a quarter of the American population. So a lot of people saw that forum, and it got a lot of press attention. A Democratic innovator and visionary, Ms. Allison leads national efforts to build inclusive, multiracial coalitions led by women of color. She leverages media, research, and analysis to increase voter engagement and advocate for racial, economic, and gender justice. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Hill, Essence, Teen Vogue, and Newsweek. In the early 1990s, Ms. Allison earned a rare honorable discharge from the U.S. Army as a conscientious objector and works today to support courageous moral leadership. She has a BA and an MA from Stanford University. She wrote Army of None. She's appeared in hundreds of outlets. You just saw her on CNN, but she's been on MSNBC, The Washington Post, Associated Press, NPR. Her vision and goal and life's work right now is building a political home for millions of women of color nationally and especially in the battleground states this year. She was featured in Politico's 2019 Power List. So we are so lucky to have Aimee with us today. Aimee, I'm seeing 300 people, so let me switch to you. Welcome. And we thought we'd let Aimee speak for a little while and tell you about her work and what's happening right now, and then switch to kind of a conversation between Aimee and I, and then open it up to the class. So welcome, Aimee.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really honored to join you today. Thank you so much, Professor, for including me, and for really centering an understanding of the 2020 elections in the amazing trajectory of women of color stepping fully into our fierce power, just as the country needs us the most. I started She the People as a book, okay, as a book. There had been no book on women of color in American politics, even though we were the fastest growing group of voters, even though we were the best organizers for bringing new people, young people, people of color into voting and engaging, even though we were frontline on the movements that are capturing the hearts and minds of millions of us, even though we were the main vote behind electing and re-electing Barack Obama, there still hadn't been an acknowledgement of this political force. And so I started writing a book, and the book was not about a racial identity. The term women of color is about, it's a term of political solidarity across race that has its foundation in the political sense from the 70s. In 1976, there was the first women's convention. It was the brainchild of Patsy Mink and Bella Abzug and the women who were first in Congress, who were able to convince Congress to fund an effort to create a women's agenda and to really capture women's political power. The thing is, and you'll probably, I heard it earlier today, and you'll hear it, race is the most important determinant, not gender, of how people vote. And back in the 70s, the white women who organized this conference, which was in Houston, came up with a policy agenda that looks a lot like what they would call white feminist policy agenda for the nation. And a group of Black women realized that they had what they called a minority plank in that agenda. It was like one page that did not capture the deep pain of economic injustice, racial injustice, and lack of opportunity and white supremacy that Black women faced. And so they created a Black women's agenda, and the Latina, Asian American, and Indigenous women say, hey, we want to be part of that. So they came up with a term to encapsulate this political view that is both policy and solidarity. And they called themselves Women of Color and advocated within the larger group of white women to adopt this justice-based plank of women of color. And that served as really the motivation and the foundation for the work that I do today. So when I wrote this book, I started interviewing women of color across the country. Meanwhile, because of 2016's election, when I had, I was doing research for all these amazing women of color who were leading these efforts in battleground states, and understanding that the country itself was becoming majority people of color, not only in our state, California, but in places like New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, Florida, Georgia. These are the swing states right now. These are the states that are going to determine the results of the 2020 election and the electoral college votes. And I said, look, women of color are a quarter of the electorate in these places. And yet the ecosystem, the political, like the business of politics, everyone you see that was a talking head, people who do analysis on voting patterns, people who do polling, exit polling, that understand just all of this that helps to shape the public perception. None of that was present in 2016. And in fact, so much so that when the news came out that the majority of white women voted for Trump, there was shock and dismay amongst white women I knew. There was a lack of self-awareness that white people in this country were, including white women, were a conservative force and had been for decades. So how do we have a women's agenda without an analysis on race? We can't. Because women of color in 2016 voted overwhelmingly against Trump. When I said in that clip, we were his kryptonite, we saw through him, we knew what he was doing, and we did not buy it, and we were the most reliable, highest turnout group against Trump. So instead of the book, which was, would have been wonderful, and I hope to someday write it, I started an organization intended to build the political power and the voice of women of color in the time that the country desperately needed our leadership. In a time in 2016, the term women of color was never used to understand the American voting population, to understand trends. And I set to change it, to tell a new story to the country. And I launched in 2016, 9 weeks before the midterm election. And I said then, and I said now, that women of color and our turnout, our enthusiastic support, our power on the ground will drive the Democratic multiracial coalition. And if candidates speak to us, if they engage us, if they prioritize our votes over the traditional swing voter, like the white woman in the suburbs that Trump keeps talking about, like that as not the most valuable Democratic Party voter, but us, then we have a chance to win back the White House and the Senate in 2020, but to also create a politics we have never seen. When we told that story, it was very compelling for reporters, editors, bookers, producers who'd covered 2016 election and missed and miscalculated how Trump was successful. How did Trump win? What are we missing? I said, you're missing women of color. And so this last journey of the last 3 years has been establishing in the press and in the public consciousness women of color as a powerful constituency. And now people believe the thing that was impossible for the public to imagine, which was that women of color are the drivers. They are our turnout will determine the election. We are powerful. And you're talking about a group of people, just like with the restaurant workers and the tipped workers, the professor was talking about, you're talking about women of color who have been suffering long before Trump, the cruel policies and practices of this country, and who uphold a deep and abiding vision about the power of democracy, a multiracial democracy, and that women of color with high turnout, particularly in the battleground states that are majority people of color, and those states, again, Arizona, Texas, Florida, Georgia, and 3 Midwest states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. And because we're such a powerhouse, that if we increase our voter turnout of women of color 2 to 4% in those states, we win the Electoral College, we win the White House, and we win key Senate states. So my goal has been, despite the pandemic, despite the unemployment, the housing crisis that's upon us, and all of the problems, our goal is, now that we've established the power of our constituency, and that we have changed culture so that we are seen and heard, we have to actually have women of color, particularly in those key states, strategically, have a plan to vote, to safely vote, but also have their votes counted. Because on top of everything else, women of color across Indigenous, Latina, Asian American, and Black women are the most targeted for voter suppression. And in those states, there are Republican Secretary of States and Republican governors who are dedicated to trying to limit or prevent our votes from being counted. So our goal is to reach 1 million women of color. Our political program has already started, and there's so much at stake that when we pushed to have Kamala Harris, or I should say a woman of color as VP, we started that effort in February when it was clear that 2 really older white guys were going to be at the top of the ticket. We said, look, we heard from women of color when we did listening sessions that having a woman of color at the top of the ticket is going to deepen enthusiasm when there wasn't. There wasn't deep enthusiasm for Biden. Adding Kamala Harris on the ticket as first Asian American, first Black woman at the top of the ticket was more than symbolic, it was strategic. And now we have something that can excite and unify people. My overall goal in my political work is not simply to elevate the voice of women of color who have been ignored and sidelined and dismissed and abused in American politics and life. It isn't just that. It is to build a multiracial coalition to transform American democracy. And we are at an inflection point. We have basically 2 choices in my view. One is very clear. If you watched what Trump is saying in Wisconsin, where we have a Trump and the Republican Party justifying terrorist killings of people on the street, and you see more and more of this. So white supremacist, fascist, where there is unchecked power, and the safeguards that have protected our civil and rights, and they go away. Or we can choose to go the route of the multiracial democracy to make this American democracy live up to its greatest promise. And the group of people who best understand it, who are strongest and who have demonstrated, particularly Black women, that we are the highest vote turnout and that we are the pro-democracy patriots, that we will knit together a multiracial coalition and go forward. That's where I am putting my belief in, and that's my spark of hope. So that's my work, and I'm happy to talk to you about any aspect of it that interests you in your study.
Thank you so much, Amy. So much to talk to you about and ask you about. But let's start with this particular election. You know, women of color have been playing this role, frankly, for a really long time, as you and I know. What is it about this moment, about this context, about this election that has finally elevated and helped people understand the importance of women of color? Why is it in this year that women of color have finally made it to the top of the ticket in a year when we've got, you know, some of the most virulent and obvious racism that we've ever seen, and sexism?
I think a number of things happened. You know, often politics or political power, when you think about who has power, we think about who's in office already. But political power emanates from other places. And part of where politics and power for women of color has come from was literally in the narrative, crafting a narrative about our strength. When I said, like in California, 1 of 4 voters are women of color. We are the majority of women, right? Or if I say we're the, like I reposition which votes matter and how powerful we are. I reject the notion that we should ever be considered minorities. We are not. I reject the notion that $1.5 billion that's being raised and spent in a typical presidential year, majority of it goes to trying to convince swing voters. I mean, that's still happening. The governor of, the Republican former governor of Ohio had space in the Democratic convention. Why would they have a white guy Republican unless they thought that he was going to attract a particular type of voter? So we have a political culture which has undervalued us for so long. But if we tell a different story, which is what the work is about our power, we start to change perception. When I say we hadn't been polled or polling and data and surveys, lists of voters and who matters, the vote potential, all of that. Those are the things that we are changing the story about. And I think all that has contributed over time to having people understand who women of color voters are and what our potential is. So I think for 2020, things have gotten so bad for so many people. There's overwhelming fear. There's been a diminishment and disrespect of news media. Who do you trust? And when we ask, who do you trust? Like fundamentally, like who do we trust to get us through here? Who is actually going to, should it be white women who voted for Trump right now? Or should it be the, who? And when people are asking a question of trust, they have to look at things differently. It's really causing a different kind, and in that void, women of color have been a very clear moral voice. I mean, as things crumble around us and the norms and assumptions that we had about American politics have been violated around us, the clearest, strongest voices have been women of color, not just those who are elected in Congress, but those who are leading efforts on the ground, those who are leading movements. It's very clear. And we are responding to the nation's need for trust in a very powerful way. And when you were reading my bio, I was like, part of the reason I started even writing about women of color in a book, in 2015 was because here is a group of people that we've never been handed anything. We've never been given anything. We have so much courage that's demonstrated. Courage in terms of taking a lead and self-sacrifice, courage in terms of fighting to vote and organize despite the difficulties. So I think all of those have contributed together to this moment for women of color, where the constituency and the power met the candidacy at the top of the ticket meets our power to determine the results of the 2020 election.
Yeah, it's so interesting when you say, as we watch things fall apart, because that is definitely what's happening. Things are falling apart. I had a funder tell me yesterday, feels like America is a is a dumpster fire right now.
Yeah.
And so in previous moments like that, during economic recessions of the last like 20, 30 years, there often is a scapegoating that occurs among, you know, certain populations, segments of the white population, that elected officials really play into: scapegoating of immigrants, scapegoating of people of color, scapegoating of Black people in particular. That happens during economic recessions. And in the past, when that's happened, I have seen a kind of a retrenchment, frankly, a cowardly retrenchment of the Democratic Party, saying, oh, we shouldn't talk about race. Race is third rail. Gender is third rail. We don't use those terms. We don't talk about those things, particularly not during a recession when there's a tendency to blame each other for the troubles we're facing. And something different happened here, where you've got not just a recession, but the worst depression, I think, that we've seen since the Great Depression. And at the same time, a national uprising around race, at the same time, a new willingness among white people to talk about race that we haven't really seen in a really long time. And so the idea of divide and conquer isn't working as well. What do you think is different or has changed?
I think you're absolutely right, because the concept of a multiracial identity in politics, where it's born of a country that there is no majority and minority. Like, we live in California, we you know, or those of you who are, you know, all over the world, if you look at many parts of the states, it's like not, there's no majority. I mean, I'm a Black woman, I live in Oakland, but there's no majority of any one group. And, you know, one of the most powerful things that we have seen in this moment is for people to find common ground in building a multiracial solidarity and political power. We have the numbers, we need the language, and we need the justice agenda. When I talk about like economic and racial and gender justice, that's part of a agenda we can all buy into. But the I think in this moment is racial justice. And I think the willingness of people across race to say Black Lives Matter and to organize ourselves and to join the call for America to account for its racism, to take a very painful look at the ways in which people's lives are destroyed by a system. And we're, you know, one of the most amazing exports, I think, from our hometown has been this ability to organize a race, have a heart for your own people and love for your own and also others, and to see that our fate is bound together. And you know, when I did the presidential forum last April, you have to understand, we had this huge and very diverse group of candidates who were running for president in the primary. And I'm not a person that had like big ties to all the big organizations. And I said, but I want to do a forum, and I want to do it in the city where the term women of color was born, in Houston. Houston is the most diverse city, Harris County in the country. Majority people of color, obviously. But there's something special about this language of solidarity and organizing multiracially that I have to offer to the country as an export from the Bay Area of the way that we've done things. So to have a room of 2,000 women of color from all over the country, and be able to ask candidates like, why should women of color vote for you, which is a question no one has ever asked. Those are like really, really remarkable things. I think this moment, though, is about us uniting under racial justice. And that's something that every race and gender can get behind. And we can find common cause in, and we can advocate for one another in our own communities. I think that's, to me, that's the biggest thing that we've seen move in terms of our culture, space in our culture for that.
So speaking of racial justice as the word of the day, I want to talk to you a little bit about Kamala Harris, because I know you know, Amy, we have lots of mutual, amazing organizer leader friends here in Oakland, your hometown, my hometown. that, or where I live now, that are not thrilled about Kamala Harris's track record and her background, about her role as an attorney general and a district attorney. So why is she perfect? You know, do you think she's a perfect candidate? Why focus on her and having a woman of color as a vice president? Even when I know you've done focus groups with women of color and surveys with women of color across the country, and the thing that they said was most important was actually the progressive values, the progressive policies, more so than anything else. So what is it about having a woman of color who's not perfect, maybe not the most progressive candidate, but why is that still so important for you?
It's incredibly important. It's incredibly important. Let me just, women of color are held to a completely different standard than white dudes. I'm just going to say that right now, because most people don't understand that Kamala Harris right now, as a senator, she has the most progressive, one of the most progressive voting records in the Senate. So who else is in the Senate? Warren, Sanders, you know, the Massachusetts senator that just won re-elect yesterday. I mean, listen, nobody is perfect. Our democracy is never about one person. It isn't. This hero worship and like the thing that worshiping celebrity, that got us Trump. A democracy is about all of us and about seeing ourselves reflected in leadership and our issues, both. And the thing about Kamala Harris, which is important, is to not allow people to hold her to a different standard, you know, than a Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, not allow that. But also to see how she's showing up now. The Justice and Policing Act that she was a co-sponsor of, the $2,000 a month payments that she's been advocating for, and she was an author of that legislation to help people through these terrible times right now and to offer some financial relief to people who are suffering right now are two examples. Bringing up Breonna Taylor's name on a regular basis, it matters to us that she keeps demanding justice for Breonna Taylor. But having said that, it isn't a requirement for people to be perfect. Like, I could get in a conversation with any number of you right now, and we'd probably find something that we didn't fully agree on. But does that mean that we stop working and organizing together? It does not. Do I think that the movement, Black and brown women, would have more access and influence with a Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket? Yes. Do I think we have a better chance of being part of transition teams? We could be more a part of the cabinet. Do I think that we would have influence on the first 100 days with Kamala Harris there? Yes. Do I think that the democracy rises and sets on one person? No. So I advocated deeply for a woman of color, and there were several amazing women of color who were being considered, including our Karen Bass, who's a congresswoman down in LA, and other women. I was a big advocate very early on for Stacey Abrams, who I knew before she ran for governor of Georgia, and know that she carries the agenda. I believe she'll be president someday. And yes, you can quote me. I want Stacey Abrams to be president someday. But right now, we have Kamala Harris, which makes a lot of sense. And the response that we got from women and women of color that on the ground who are like local elected officials in our network, who lead voter registration, who lead issue-based, you know, like they lead a climate justice organization, or they call and talk to voters about getting registered, all that has been overwhelmingly positive. So she has given us a way to deepen enthusiasm strategically for 2020. She's opened a door, and she's also, it's never one candidate. So the thing that most people aren't aware of, and we've compiled a list to release out, is that there's an historic number of women of color on the ballot in 2020. There are 3 women of color running for Senate, including Marquita Bradshaw in Tennessee, who raised a fraction of the amount of the establishment Democratic candidate in the primary, and is now a Black woman that is a Democratic nominee in Tennessee. It's amazing. Look her up. We have an historic number of women of color who are running for Congress, state ledge, local. So I said today in the Washington Post, I was quoted in the Washington Post today, Kamala Harris has been deployed to talk to Black voters, particularly Black women's turnout, not our percentage, because we already demonstrated that we will vote. We're the most loyal Democrats. Our turnout numbers in places like Michigan, where the gap is 11,000, in places like Arizona, where the gap is 70,000, our turnout will determine the results of the statewide elections in battleground states. Texas has the largest population of Black people, and Texas used to be written off as a red state. Black voters, along with Latino voters, can close the 3% gap and win Texas. So in today's Washington Post, I comment on the fact that Kamala Harris she went to Howard University. She has deep ties in networks like the AKAs, Black sororities. She can speak the language of racial solidarity. She knows how to do it because she turned out 40 million, her percentage, a winning percentage of 40 million California voters, of which there is no majority. And you cannot win right now without being able to speak that language statewide. So this is all very powerful. I think the last thing is, her being Black and Indian is significant. We have to have a much more complex way of thinking about racial identity and how we show up in the world as our country's demographics change. And I love it. It's a amazing opening for us, up and down ballot, and a way for us to, again, express our political power.
Yes. I gotta say, my daughters are Black and Indian, and it's incredible for them to see somebody that's exactly like them in a vice presidential nominee role. It's unheard of. It's unheard of. So it's really amazing. So let's talk a little bit about voter suppression. You mentioned it early on. You mentioned that women of color are really the target of this more than anybody else. And can we talk about all kinds of voter suppression, from I work 3 jobs, I don't have the ability to get to the polls, to I never got it in the mail because the frickin' post office is being shut down, to actual voter suppression, like my name's not on the rolls, or I voted and my vote's not being counted. How in all of those ways are women of color being targeted, and how does that impact everybody, not just women of color?
Well, yeah, we gotta understand voter suppression as a system. It's not one thing. I watched it up close when I was supporting Stacey Abrams' gubernatorial bid in 2018. They have many, many, many tricks. First, let me talk about the not obvious things that lead to lower turnout. Lack of investment or speaking to voters. Let me just talk, because this is bigger than party, because it's not like, I'm not here to say, oh, yay, Democratic Party. That's not me. But the Democratic Party has a long, long tradition of not investing and speaking to voters of color and taking them for granted, and spending the bulk of the money on ads to convince moderate white voters or conservative white voters to go their way, because those were the voters that were considered most valuable. And that goes everything from the consultants who pull lists of who to call and who to mail to what the commercials look like. In 2016, Hillary Clinton had a lot of commercials aimed at other white women who she believed would back her because, hey, I'm one of you. But the thing is that white women, including in California, all over the country, its most reliable base when they run for office at any level are women of color. Women of color are most likely to vote for women of any race. So just when we think about how voter suppression starts with not investing in voters, but it's more than that. Part of it is that in states where, like Georgia, that have exact match requirements that take people off voter rolls, they routinely remove people who they say, okay, well, you haven't voted in the last 2 municipal elections or the primaries, so you must not be real. We're going to take you off. And like hundreds of thousands of people. In 2016, 700,000 Black people were removed from the voting rolls before Election Day. So you imagine like you registered, you didn't vote for some things, you were kind of a 3 out of 5 election voter, but you still want to vote for president, and then you show up on election day. Another way voter suppression happens is, and we've seen these terrible, terrible scenes in Kentucky in their primary, where voting locations have been consolidated. We saw that in Texas and in Arizona. The reason I keep pointing out those swing states is that's what we're gonna see, is they'll take 15 polling places that are in heavily Democratic, people of color places, and they'll consolidate to one. In the case in Kentucky, the parking lot was half an hour away, and they closed this polling location at 5. So there were people with their kids trying to run, and they were banging on locked doors trying to vote. It's terrible voter suppression. And then, of course, there's disinformation, trying to discourage people from showing up in the first place and making it difficult to be vote by mail. So if you're in Texas, you have to be over 65 with a validated excuse in order to be vote by mail in the middle of a pandemic. If you want to be vote by mail in Georgia, you can, but there's six steps, including you have to send a copy of your license. Now, who has a Xerox? I mean, just like there's multiple ways that they're preventing people. So our effort has to be in, first and foremost, we're building the first list of women of color voters in the country. When you go in the business of politics, you go to these data firms, and the data firms have so many ways of understanding the white electorate. Who's married, who's not married, who's like a fundamentalist Christian, who's not, who's this, who's that. But that isn't how they look at women of color. They have hardly any data in any data sets. So we have to buy and compile commercial data and voter roll data and go talk to women of color. Are you on the voter roll right now? How can you get back on it? You know what I mean? Like, educate state by state. And then the most important way for us is vote by mail. And we heard that from Michelle Obama in the convention. Vote by mail isn't the solution because of all the interference of taking sorting machines that will slow down mail. And I know that part of the play is for millions of vote by mail ballots to be delayed in the mail and not counted. In California, it won't necessarily, because we're so heavily Democratic, won't necessarily determine the Electoral College votes ultimately. But in the states with the razor thin margins I've been talking about, it will be, the delay could have a terrible effect on the results of the election, particularly if CNN and MSNBC and Fox want to call the election the night of the 3rd. So for us, election day starts October 15th for us, because we have early vote options and other options, and we cannot look at election day as, hey, stand in an 8-hour line. Because if people who have to work or people who have kids, they can't, I would have a very difficult time being in a line for 8 hours to cast a vote. So for us, it's all about banking our votes early and walking in our paper ballots. So the final thing I'll say is, amongst women of color, particularly Black women, like, I was raised with this notion that my dad would take me with him before I was eligible to vote, to the voting, and he would say, our people died for this right. So it is a cultural value of Black women in particular to vote, and we vote in person. So we tried a few months ago to say, okay, well, you guys will vote by mail. Now that looks like it's not going to happen. People who have paper ballots will walk them in and drop them into collection boxes. So I think there's going to be a lot of moving parts. When I heard that the RNC, the Republican National Convention, was spending $20 million to hire poll watchers who are basically armed white people who will be standing there while people are in these long lines intimidating people, that scares me to no end, because the shooting that we saw on the street that's being justified on Fox News is, that threat is enough to keep people away from voting. So it's a lot. And I think we should go forward understanding that, like, if you look at Stacey Abrams, and she started an organization called Fair Fight, her lesson is we need overwhelming turnout, we need a decisive victory, and we need to make sure that enough people vote to overcome the voter suppression techniques. So we have to just have our eyes open. We have to plan early, and we have to have a plan for everybody in our network. And it's a sad state that it feels like a final defense of the right that people fought and died for, that was guaranteed from the now defunct Voting Rights Act, is now under question. And we have to organize and turn out, understanding that there are people and forces who do not want our vote to be counted.
Amy, do you think you could actually tell the story of what happened with Stacey Abrams in 2018, who she was running against, who was kind of controlling that election, what exactly happened in the final hours, and then what she's now saying is the lesson for us for 2020? Because I think it's a telling story, a warning for us of what could happen nationally and what we can do about it.
Well, Stacey Abrams, I should just say, she's one of the most brilliant leaders and strategists I know. And before she, I went down to one of most southern counties when she declared her candidacy for governor in the primary. The thing about it is Black and brown women are most of us are Democrats, but they're most likely to be primaried, challenged in a primary. And that happened with Stacey Abrams, where the Democratic Party ran a white millionaire moderate woman, also named Stacey, against her in the primary. But the reason that Stacey Abrams is so brilliant was she said, look, Georgia is a swing state. We're almost majority people of color. And if you look statewide across small towns, suburban centers, and urban centers, there are upwards of 800,000 eligible, unregistered people of color. And so her campaign from the very beginning was predicated on the fact that she could get people that hadn't been engaged and inspired or spoken to at all, registered and voting. She won landslide in the primary. She increased Latino, Asian American, and people don't think about the South. They don't have there's something like a limitation in terms of who actually lives in the states, but like Asian Americans and Latinos turnout increased 6 times. Black turnout increased exponentially. And the turnout, and her strategy was always, we're going to get people out early. But she was running against the Secretary of State, Brian Kemp. The Secretary of State is the guy who determines the rules and the practices to implement the election. So it's like if you were playing football, against the person. That's a bad analogy. I'm bad with sports analogies. Basically, the person who's determining the rules was her competitor in the race. And so when organizations would submit registrations that they had collected of people of color across the state, his office would lose them or refuse to put them on the voter rolls. He was routinely taking people off the voter rolls. He was cheating. And at the end of the day, the implementation of the of that particular election had a lot of the voter suppression that we had seen, where in Fulton County, Black voters were standing in line like 8 hours, and that it was just rampant cheating. And at the end, Brian Kemp claimed victory, but Stacey Abrams refused to immediately concede because of the cheating that had happened, and realized that even though she had taken Georgia, which had always been in the past election cycles dismissed as a blue state, it's really controlled by Republicans, and it had been for 10 years, at least 10 years, no Democrat had been elected statewide. She'd taken it from, hey, this is a red state, to razor thin 99,000 margin, almost to the brink, even with voter suppression, of turning the state blue. And she's the reason, her campaign is a reason that Georgia's a swing state right now in the 2020 election. When she never did concede, because when Brian Kemp cheated his way to the governorship, there was something very important of her both calling it out and fighting the voter suppression. So she founded a group called Fair Fight, which I believe now is addressing in the courts and in practice voter suppression in 20 states. And she's using a lot of her experience in Georgia to inform the strategy and the support that they're doing right now. So that I think, though, when we think about Sarah, the lesson there is we know how blatantly they will cheat. We understand that that is seriously at play in 2020. It's shameless. So we have to have measures and countermeasures to try to overcome what is just a terrible system that prevents people from exercising their very, very basic citizenship right, which is to vote.
It's so funny because I remember in 2018 being in spaces where Stacey would speak, and you'd have a lot of white donors here in California or in other places who just couldn't wrap their minds around the idea that in America an election was occurring where the person, running the election was running for office, right? That person running his own election was running for office. And it was kind of this no, it's just not true, or it's this idea, I think, just like there's been, I think, this awakening that a lot of white people and a lot of people of color have very different conceptions of the police. Some of us see police as, frankly, a terror and a nightmare, and others see police as a source of safety and support and protection. In the same way, I think there's two very different concepts of our democracy. I think a lot of white America still fundamentally believes that we live in a very functional democracy. We live in a functional democracy that works. And when you vote, it's counted. And anything we're talking about in terms of voter suppression is minor and it's a bit exaggerated. And then there's people of color who've experienced generations of voter suppression and who've experienced this kind of cheating and this kind of dysfunctional democracy. And so you have two very different perceptions of truly, do we have a functional democracy or not? And so to me, that's why some of the work that you do, that's not just about working with electeds, but really elevating the work of organizers on the ground who are fighting to make it a functional democracy beyond just let's all go vote, let's get everybody to turn out. It's also about the fight to make this a functional democracy and to elevate the fact that it's not. So can you talk about some of that work of kind of the work of organizers and women of color who've been fighting on these issues for a long time, and as it relates to the election right now, why is it so important to think about organizing?
Yeah, I mean, from its very beginning, two things. We wanted to make sure she the people is grounded in the actual work on the ground. So the most excellent, effective organizing, pro-democracy work that's being done is being led by women of color, hands down. In Georgia, Stacey Abrams was on the ballot in 2018, but it was Inse Ufot, whose parents came from Nigeria. She's like a attorney and head of the New Georgia Project, who is responsible for heading a statewide effort to register over 200,000 Georgians. It was Inse Ufot. She's not famous. That she's you cannot have a functional democracy, as you said, without having people who are dedicated to fighting for reaching out, registering people, giving people, talking with people about how to vote and vote safely, and advocating for the right kinds of leaders and issues to be on the ballot. In Virginia, Tram Nguyen, who came from Vietnam as a refugee, as a little kid, is co-leading Virginia New Majority. Their goal is to transform that state, and they have by focusing on people of color. They have won in the last, it's like year round. It's not like it's election time, they'll come in they're a year round organization that registers, and we say engage, talks to people about the issues, supports candidates that reflect the community. And in the last 4 years, they have successfully activated Virginia's electorate, which is like when she moved there were hardly any Asian Americans, very few immigrants. And now Virginia, just like the rest of our, many of our states, is so diverse that they've really captured the power of the communities. They have 3 statewide seats that are Democratic, and they just won the majority of their delegate house, which is their state legislature. That's Tram Wen. Andrea Mercado is the head of Florida New Majority, and that's another very similar. They have a very similar theory of change, which is to reach out and register and engage voters of color. This was the group, New Florida Majority, under Andrea's leadership and all her organizers statewide, that passed a law, successfully organized and passed a law to restore voting rights to what they call returning citizens, people who had through having a felony on their record, they had their voting rights stripped away. And by doing that, they tipped the balance of power on behalf of people of color in Black and brown communities. Now, the Republicans have tried to, put a poll tax on that and challenge it in the courts. But the fact of the matter is, New Virginia Majority is doing this amazing transformative work. I could go on, like in Texas, it's Crystal Zermeño and Michelle Tramillo in Texas Organizing Project. In Arizona, it's Montse Arenat and One Arizona and all their organizers. What I'm saying to you is, in the places that will determine the future of American, like the leadership and the vision going forward and our issues, these are women of color that are working every day really hard with our communities and very effectively. And they're the reason why we have a shot at recapturing the White House and the Senate, because they're actually making sure it's one person, one vote. In just because our population, so the thing is, just because our population is changing, where the majority of people are people of color, doesn't mean we have political power. It doesn't automatically translate. It doesn't mean our issues or leaders from our movements get support, because there's a system that was set up hundreds of years ago that did not include us. It included white dudes who owned people, who had the power, and the same structures and political systems, just like everything else, has power and influence on our the way that we do politics today. So we have to intentionally work with and support the organizers on the ground who are building multiracial democracy from the ground up. And when we were talking to women of color over the last two months ago, 6 weeks ago, from battleground states, the most exciting stuff is happening at the local level. If you think about the calls to defund the police or calls to racial justice, those are local fights. So the energy isn't necessarily just White House or Senate. It's much more local, and that's where these organizers are getting people involved. If you talk about defunding the police, and the professor and I know in California, in Oakland, the calls to defund the police had to be championed by someone to get rid of the police force in the Oakland schools, which we have a police force. What the hell? And it was millions of dollars going to that instead of students' needs. It was a woman of color who championed that. There was organizers that she worked with, and we saw that defunding and ultimately eliminating the police force in Oakland schools, even though there was a national call, it was a local fight. And what we're going to see in 2020 is that the city council, school board, county seats, and state legislative seats are going to determine and engage us most. Like, for example, in California, we have something on the ballot that would restore affirmative actions, and it would consider race in contracting and education and things like that. These are big deals, and these are not necessarily at the top of the ticket. So I think that's where the organizers on the ground connect what we care about most deeply with what affects our lives most closely. And that gets people engaged in the political process.
Sorry, just one last question, then we want to open it up to the class. Amy, I just want you to tell us what's giving you hope right now. It just feels like such a turbulent and challenging time. What's giving you hope? What are the bright spots you're seeing leading up to this election?
Like, if you look at my background, I spent a couple days in this pool because I was getting a little bit too overwhelmingly. I was just like everybody else, feeling that fear and hearing a lot of hopelessness and desperation, because we're just about 60 days from the election. And the battle lines are being drawn, violence is being stoked, people are being attacked. So what gives me hope in this moment is the moral clarity and courage of the people that I work with every day. I mean, they're standing up against and speaking, in defense of people who have been marginalized and suffer. I mean, the goal of, or the voice of women who are doing the hard work is giving me hope, because there isn't evidence that for sure will be successful, but people are dedicated to the fight. And because now we're intentionally building this network, a multiracial community of women of color, we can talk to each other more and across states. And what I see is women willing to do whatever it takes to vote. And because, like, Black women like myself, we know, because culturally we understood that our people fought and died for the right, that we are willing to do whatever it takes. And this sense of courage and clarity, we're clear, sense of focus in the last 2 months leading to the election, sense of who the evil and enemy is, the sense of love and justice that we're promoting, despite the fact that people are doing everything they can to dismantle the protections for people that we have won over the last 50 years. So the hope is in the courage of the people, and the courage specifically of women, the women of color, who have we have a lot to lose, and yet the system hasn't ever really served us. And we're holding a vision of a politics we haven't seen. And this vision is like a faith that we believe that we can transform the country and to make it a just place where everyone belongs and people's basic humanity is supported, and we're served by our government. So despite it all, that's who I am too. It's like, I believe in it. It's worth fighting for. And there are thousands and thousands of people who are willing to do whatever it takes to defend democracy and to make sure that we have that we can vote and that we fight for the next phase in the country.
Thank you so much, Amy. You give me hope and inspiration. Professor Cohen, are you going to moderate questions that have been coming in through chat?
Sure, I'll start briefly with some really good, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you to both of you. Let's keep this going. I want to turn this, ask in particular, Aimee Allison, who has a terrific question that I invite her to ask, please.
So first of all, thank you for coming, and best of luck to next week's speaker, because you set the bar really high. My question was, you mentioned kind of the intersection between, race and gender, but between different, racial minority groups, how do we ensure that there's continued solidarity, especially as their lived experiences kind of begin to diverge, especially on like a class level? And I guess the example I'm thinking of specifically, and you're seeing it with the Prop 16 campaign, is how stuff like affirmative action gets weaponized to pit people against each other, which doesn't really allow for any growth on, the things that connect everybody.
I love the question because it really points to the greatest need. And the reason I do my work actually is to create this language of solidarity and to encourage people across our spectrum, people of color, to find common ground and move forward together. Now, it doesn't mean though we're going to have 100% of the people. When I saw Nikki Haley on the stage, basically repudiating Black Lives Matter and Black people's lived experience and evidence that Black people are being murdered by police with impunity, she dismisses that. And you see that, okay, she's a woman of color. I don't think she would call herself a woman of color, but okay. She's a brown woman who said that thing. So we're not going to get 100% of the people. I don't know if that's the goal. The goal is for us, though, to create a coalition with shared values. It's really deeper than a policy platform. It's our values. And this is an opportunity for us to Trump, this is not just Trump. I mean, I don't think Trump couldn't exist without a culture that divides and conquers. But like the professor was saying earlier, this divide and conquer strategy can be defeated with solidarity. And part of what needs to happen right now is to uplift people who are fluent in the language of solidarity. So in the Prop 16 example you gave, and I'm on the committee, so I can say, because you have in particular Chinese American communities, like in Seattle and other places that have organized kind of like Tea Party, kind of like the right wing anti-affirmative action like group. The best way to lead a multiracial coalition is to center the voices of Chinese American folks who believe in a justice agenda, believe in racial justice. There's a lot. I mean, what's really interesting was the assumption was Asian Americans were somehow conservative, but that is not true. Asian American women are the second most progressive voting bloc, fastest growing voting bloc in the country. And we need to hear a lot more from Asian Americans, for example, who speak the language of multiracial solidarity, that see themselves in an array. They see themselves connected to both the traditions and the aspirations and the communities, the other communities that it's possible to like organize with and win elections with. So I think you're pointing to perhaps our biggest need. I mean, maybe like in this class, there's going to be someone who like helps to create much more of this elevating stories, creating like a living archive of examples of solidarity that we can use to inspire and show people how it's done. I think because half of my family is white, I'm a Black woman with a white family, and that's a racial complexity that people just going to have to deal with and wrap their minds around. But on the white side of my family, if you ask like my mom or like what percentage of white women or white women I'll start with, are racial justice advocates, she would I guess 10%, she guesses 2%. So there is so much that we need to do in terms of elevating white people who speak the language of racial solidarity and people of color. And I think by doing that, we knit the connections between the communities that we need in order to have political power. That's to me the next, that is actually the front, that's the leading edge of what we need to do in order to solidify multiracial democracy that has political structures based in white supremacy that still exist right now. And you have the evil genius of white supremacy to try to bring in certain groups. Oh, you're from Korea. Okay, you get in. Oh, you're from this, like kind of allowing and expanding who's considered honorary. And that's how white supremacy has worked in order to divide and conquer. So we need to really be fluent and powerful in undercutting that power, diffusing the power of white supremacy over our politics.
Great. Let's turn to Avni Prasad.
Hi, thank you so much, Amy, for coming to talk to us. I appreciate this conversation and your words in a lot of ways, and it's very powerful. My question is, earlier you mentioned Kamala is at the top of the ticket is more than symbolic, it's strategic. Is there a concern with this being kind of considered a strategy to get more voters that may in fact lose sight of the important question, which is not how do we get women of color voters, but if we are pandering their votes, how are we, what will we do for the women of color community? And maybe like a example of this as a strategy in another way is at the RNC. I remember Trump ran an ad where he was talking about how he appointed more women than any other presidential candidate. And true or not, it was a strategy as a way of kind of getting women voters. And there's like this sense of maybe taking these votes for granted by saying these things rather than earning them. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that and how exactly we'd go about making sure that we're not losing sight of this focus of what we're actually going to do for that community.
Yeah, because I appreciate your question. I mean, for me, what's behind that question is, hey, we are now being seen and heard for the first time, really, in a presidential. Nobody talked about women of color in 2016. It was not a thing, right? So now we are, and we don't want to be pandered to or taken for granted. And I say yes to that. That's why I started She the People. 100% yes. It is not pandering to put someone at the top of the ticket when they're speaking to our issues. That's not pandering. I always thought that the biggest risk when we talk about, like when I talk about women of color, was to do it in a way that was like essentialist. When you have someone like Nikki Haley running around, or Diamond and Silk, or whatever, those crazy people that that really are in service to a white supremacist agenda, right? Okay, it's not going to be enough for us to have an essentialist argument. You're a woman of color, right? Therefore, you're a good leader. That has never really been the whole point. The point is to empower the million of it. There's 38 million women of color voters. We're all over the place. We're a majority of women in so many states. And to make sure that what we want, are the politics and the vision we want, are realized. And having Kamala Harris on the top of the ticket is incredible, because we now see ourselves as women of color in all the complexity of our identity, that we could lead the country. And so I think a lot needs to happen. It's not like that was the end. Okay, we're done. But when I say that it was important for Black women and women of color who delivered the election or re-election of Barack Obama, didn't get that credit for that, okay? But we did. And that was the last Democrat elected. It was because he could inspire multiracial democracy, multiracial coalitions. Like, that's very important. When I say it's strategic, it's because you got to be able to, despite all the challenges, get Black and brown voters to the polls. They got to vote. They got to vote. And they got to see a reason to vote. And for the women in our circle, there's a reason. There's a reason to vote. Because Biden didn't inspire a ton of enthusiasm. He didn't. And there was more enthusiasm for other people who ran in the primary. But with Kamala Harris, we've just seen a deepening enthusiasm, which is really great. In those states that we're focused on, they have key Senate races, like Mark Kelly is running for Senate in Arizona. Mark Kelly cannot be elected without Latinas. He can't. So making us powerful, making us visible, our power visible as a constituency, makes the politicians and the candidates have to listen to us, or not, to their own detriment. And it gives us more influence. It's not everything, but it's a good step. I don't think we should take our eyes off of continuing to push our agenda of racial and economic and gender justice. We should continue to do that, clarify that. But it gives a new shape to what being accountable is. When Obama took office, people were like, oh, I have access. I can go to the White House or attend the meeting. So therefore, but that's not enough. It's not enough. We have to continue an inside-outside strategy where we look at our elected officials in this democracy as just being part of a solution. They're not the whole thing. And that's why I have this, that's why I'm focusing a lot now on down ballot women of color, because that's where I think most of the issues you're talking about will be fought and resolved at the local level. But I really appreciate the question. This is the question. these are the things we need people in this class to tackle, because we're just getting started. We need much more of that kind of like honest questioning, rejection of essentialist thinking, and like, oh, if it's a Black leader, they're definitely going to hold our issues. No. We're asking for something more than that, and continue to do that, because that's where I think we need to go as a country.
Can I just add to that, Amy, to second what you're saying and just give a concrete example? As you all know, I represent a constituency of 13.6 million restaurant workers who have a voter turnout rate of 12%. They voted at 12% in the past. And now they're thrilled and excited to vote because, yes, there's a woman of color, but also because Biden-Harris has endorsed a full minimum wage, moving from a $2 or $3 wage to a $15 wage with tips on top. So there's a lot more enthusiasm about, I could actually go vote myself a raise. Now, if that were it, if they're like, oh, we're going to go vote, and then the Biden-Harris team didn't deliver, you can bet your bottom barrel that a lot of those people may never vote again. They'll be disillusioned. And so it's incumbent upon us as organizers and fighters and the workers to not see Harris at the top of the ticket or any election as an end, but a beginning, because it cannot be about getting people into office. It has to be about getting people into office who then we push and hold accountable and organize around to actually deliver on the things that we need. And so to your question about, is it just about getting somebody in office, or is it about actually delivering for the women of color whose votes we want? It's much more about delivering, but having people who we can move to deliver is so critical. So
Totally. And I just wanted to say something just put a fine point on what the professor just said, which is the idea of a minimum wage, raising the minimum wage, nationally started in Seattle, was championed by a socialist city council woman, Kashama Swant. She's not famous, but she advocated for and was behind raising minimum wage in Seattle. She inspired students and low wage workers in San Jose, then San Francisco, then it went national. And it is a lot of these minimum wage, raising to 15 was fought furiously. It excluded tip workers, it excluded classes of people. But what's happened is it's moved from, hey, here's this woman of color, socialist city council person advocating for this thing, to Biden-Harris putting it in the Democratic, that's part of their plan, and they're including tip workers. She did that work in 2014. The country owes her a debt of gratitude. And she is not somebody where she's not like a household name, but I know her. I talked to her. I was like, these are the heroes who take these ideas and they push and inspire, and then so much more is possible. So, that I think, just underscoring how powerful that movement can be in just a few years.
Great. Let's turn to Vivek. You want to ask your question?
Hi, thank you, Ms. Allison, for this conversation. It's so amazing to see people fighting for a more inclusive democracy. It makes me so happy. But I was just curious about listening sessions that were mentioned previously, because you previously talked about, I just want to know, on an individual level, how did your organization understand what women of color wanted in the electorate? How did those listening sessions work? And what questions were asked?
Well, we've done polling. We've done official polling, where there's a whole, you work with a pollster and you buy a list and things like that. We've done that. We did it in the state of Nevada to find out top issues before the Nevada primary, which was the first majority people of color state. I feel like our primary process should not start in Iowa, New Hampshire, because mostly white electorates don't reflect the Democratic Party. But so we did that in Nevada. We've done informal surveys. That's how we found out that we said, look, which woman of color should be a VP when it was clear that it was Sanders and Biden? Which woman of color should be VP? And then all the names who had been mentioned, we asked, and 1,000 women came back. Stacey Abrams or Kamala Harris, that's who we want. So we do that. But in the listening sessions, it was invite only. Every woman was like, we had the vice mayor of Phoenix, right? This is a local elected official. Or we had state legislators from Virginia. These are we picked battleground state women who are local elected officials, political strategists. These are people who work, there's a whole ecosystem of type of influential political people, or they head these kind of organizations I was mentioning, the voter engagement groups, or they're advocates for, and a whole number of issues, economic justice and other kinds of things. We invited them into, we did 3 different listening sessions. I facilitated along with one of my advisors, a woman named Noni, who's really senior in terms of holding these kind of conversations. They were open-ended questions. So and it was Zoom, so it was kind of weird. Just like here, it's like, it probably would be better to get people in person, but what was really important is that we had my team behind the scenes taking notes. We told everyone this is off the record conversation where we want people to be honest. And we would ask questions like, do you see yourself in the Biden campaign? Like how we would ask a bunch of open-ended questions like, are your issues, the issues that you care about, being discussed by the Biden campaign? And then people would say what they said. And then we interjected with 3 sessions of like asking specific yes or no questions in a survey through Zoom. So we did 3 of these. And when you have a group of 20 battleground state women, and they tell you things like in the listening session, like Biden campaign hasn't been in touch in a battleground state with women of color who lead the top Black women engagement group in the state. Like, how is that possible? And so we compiled all the results, all the trends. We discovered that at that point during the listening session, majority of women wanted to see a woman of color on the top of the ticket. We still did. And then we did a USA Today, someone can Google it and share it, but we worked with USA Today to tell that story, that there's room to grow. And USA Today did a long story about the results of the listening sessions. And it was a calling in of the Biden campaign. Like, we are powerful and you must engage us because we want to win. And so that was the listening session and that strategy. So I think just in general, we don't have and we need a lot more data about women of color. There's been a Center for American Progress, and I think it's called the Asian American Political Institute, in the last year have done research on turnout. Like, for example, women of color's turnout in 2018 jumped 37% over the last midterm, and we were the reason that the House won the majority. So it's women of color. You have to thank women of color for that. So we have to be able to have a lot more data at our disposal, as well as like listening session, like just having people talk. And we're doing much more of that as part of really valuing and paying attention to what women of color are thinking across our diversity and regionally.
Great. Thank you for that. Let's turn to Allison Gracia, please. Allison, are you there?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, so my question was, the theme I feel like of this conversation was about solidarity and bringing women of color to the forefront in politics and their power in politics. What I feel like is that falling in the cracks of that are trans women, especially trans women of color. And when you say that people want to see themselves on the ticket and Kamala Harris brings that sort of representation, I feel like that really leaves out trans women of color, especially when looking at Kamala's track record as a DA. There was a lot of violence that she inflicted on these women as her time there. So where is the accountability of that? And also, like, how do we make sure that trans women are being included in these conversations? And yeah, just kind of how do we not repeat the history of like when white women had their convention and it took Black women and women of color to like say like, no, we have a voice too, and then they had to break off and make their own. How do we make sure that doesn't happen again with now trans women of color having to kind of break off and instead of being included at the get-go?
Well,
Yeah,
Amy,
I appreciate the question. From the very beginning of our organizing, trans women have been integral in She the People, trans women as women of color, because trans women of color have face the same challenges, have shown incredible moral courage and leadership in this moment. And it's important that trans women are visible in our movement. We listed 20, we had this list 20 for 2020, where in December, I worked with Elle Magazine to highlight 20 women of color to watch. And I can send the link. There's 20 women of color to watch for the 2020 elections. And Amara Jones was one of those women. Amara Jones is a founder of Translash and is both telling stories of trans women of color, and also organizing kind of a political home for trans women of color, and getting voter education and voter information out there. And I was recently on Translash, and Amara said to me, Amy, you are one of the only national organization that I know of that explicitly included trans women from the beginning. We had women on stage. We included, it's not about like diversity. That's not what it is that trans women are trans women of color are holding extremely powerful political voice right now. So everything you're saying, I agree, and is part of the movement of uplifting as part of what women of color have to be perceived as. And by the way, I always look for, and making sure that we're looking for the young woman. We're looking for the Muslim woman with the hijab, visibly Muslim woman. We're looking for indigenous women. We're looking for South Asian women. We're looking for like Pacific Islander women. We got to have a table where everyone's there. And I think that's been the challenge with, like, I'll talk to like people who are like, have this diversity and inclusion frame of mind. That's not what it is. It's about having the voice really embedded in our voice. So having said that, I think for all these candidates who, and Kamala Harris included, she was an early advocate for gay marriage in California, and there was a big fight there, but her record isn't perfect. And I think she's evolved like other people evolved from 2010 or 2011 till now. I think we gotta continue pushing to make sure that trans women are voices are upheld, uplifted, particularly trans women of color who are suffering such terrible violence and have an important leadership role to play. I was going to mention, though, there was a candidate who's going to be running in the New York election. I just want to tell you about this candidate, Elisa Crespo, trans Latinx woman who's running for a seat in New York City Council to represent the Bronx, would be the first trans person to hold a political office in the city's history, and is the education liaison in the office of the Bronx Borough President. Elisa launched her race last year, and her election is going to be in 2021. Why am I telling you this? Because I'm very interested in supporting our emerging leadership. So it's not like Elisa's just trans leader, just Latinx, just in New York, but all those things where we need to uplift and support the candidates who are coming with an agenda in leadership. So.
Great, thank you. So we want to ask two questions. I will ask the last one just out of consensus on what's emerging on the chat, but I do want to turn to someone in a moment. But one of the major questions that I believe this question will address is that the general lack of enthusiasm amongst particularly young people and young people of color for the ticket as it is. We know that representation of Kamala Harris in particular is very important, but there are real limitations to the politics of representation. And some of the kind of larger questions about how do you attract young people to vote for essentially, the architect of the 1994 crime bill that led to racialized mass incarceration and a district attorney in San Francisco who contributed to that mightily. There's real, this is the question that the young people in this room seem to be very, very concerned about. And I would say to this also that Joe Biden has just announced that he's going to spend $45 million running a law and order campaign ad series in which he's going to denounce rioters and looters and try and play on Trump's turf, which, if you ask me, is a losing strategy. These are, I think, I'm sort of preface this question, but I want to hear Daniel ask this. So we're getting to the hard part here. So Daniel Najera, do you want to please go ahead and address your question in addition to or beyond what I just presented?
Yeah. First, I'd like to say thank you, Amy, for being here. But my question is, how can we get the Biden and Harris campaign to start consolidating progressives or the left and women of color and new or young voters within the Democratic Party rather than their focus right now on white moderate voters who might have voted for Trump in 2016. I watched the DNC convention, I think 2 weeks ago, and that was primarily the focus of that convention. And like Professor Cohen said, there's a very lack of enthusiasm for their campaign. So what are your thoughts on that?
It's such a good question. I want to say the question is like a very, very important one, because the last 3 years, I spent a lot of time in this class telling you how much we have changed the culture. We've moved the culture to acknowledge the power and importance of women of color in particular as voters and as organizers. But the political system itself has not fully moved. Remember, I was saying $1.5 billion will be raised and spent over the course of this election cycle. And in 2016, the vast majority of it was spent chasing after moderate white voters, as you point out. That we have not fully exercised that from the practices in the political, the business of politics, to the detriment of the Biden-Harris ticket. To the detriment of the Biden-Harris ticket. I mean, the legitimate question you raise about the lack of enthusiasm is something that I heard and something that Kamala Harris helps us do. I mean, you go to school in the Bay Area. If you're in the Bay Area, we have a certain sensibility. You work in Detroit or Philly or Houston or Dallas or Miami. It's not exactly all the same, but what we heard was that Kamala Harris on the ticket helped to deepen enthusiasm to engage the most critical voters, Black and brown voters, particularly women. But I think, though, in terms of young voters, in terms of spending all this money on law and order, in terms of going on Trump's turf, those aren't strategies that will bring people in or enthusiasm. But your question was, how can the campaign bring together a progressive coalition? I'm not sure that that's going to be the most powerful way for us to think about the next 60 days. I think I have personally been in meetings, on calls with the campaign that engage key turnout voters, women of color voters. It's being able to leverage that, but also see that the power of the organizers who are on the ground, on the local campaigns, are kind of where it's at. So I agree with your concern. In the wake of George Floyd's murder, having Biden call for 300 million additional money for police. I couldn't even believe it. It was so tone deaf. We got a lot of pushback for that. And I think we have to continue being vocal. So just as the professor was saying, you know, the Biden-Harris adopted, like the campaign adopted $15 minimum raise. You know, we still have a lot of places that we need to go politically in terms of adopting a politics going to inspire. But remember, let's just think back, because I don't know how old you were when Obama was elected first. Obama was, I knew then, he's a very exciting, charismatic leader. He has a lot of respect. He's great in so many ways. But his politics weren't all progressive. Let's be honest about that. Bernie Sanders, who won, you know, was California, was very popular in California. When I brought Bernie Sanders in front of a group of women of color, it was very unpopular. He didn't know how to speak about racial justice. And so we have to bring those things together in the new generation of leadership, both the justice vision and ability to speak to a multiracial, multi-gender audience. And I'm not saying we're there yet. I think just even asking the question suggests that we have a group of leaders, we have a deep bench of leadership that we need to find, elevate, support, and get elected so that they can actually be our voice.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think these are good, is a good answer. I do, looking at the Biden campaign right now, they seem to be making absolutely all of the same mistakes that Hillary made last year in terms of fighting largely for, you know, white women, suburban moderates and trying to tack to the middle to try and pull some fraction of Republicans to their side. And by all accounts, at this point, it's not necessarily working.
They didn't make all this, with all due respect, they did not make all the same mistakes. Hillary picked a white guy as her running mate and an all-white ticket. And I'm telling you that was a fatal mistake for her campaign, because percentage-wise, women of color, Black women, were turned out for her, but numbers-wise, she dampened enthusiasm. People weren't, you know, why would I vote for that? So at least we don't have that mistake. They're making other mistakes, but not that mistake.
And that point is well made and well taken. You're right. I mean, Tim Kaine added exactly nothing to Hillary's campaign, zero. So I agree with you on that, and that point is well taken. Thank you for that. Just as a consensus of one of the questions that has come up and a way to sort of end on a sort of movement-oriented note, what a lot of the students are asking is, what can we do about voter suppression? What can we as individuals, as students do to try and push back against this problem? And let me just invite you to have this be this sort of last question and offer you to sort of, and if you can offer some sort of answer to that, to what we can do about this and find a way to end it for us. Thank you.
Okay, three things. First, I want to stay in touch with you. I do this because I believe that your generation is going to make real the wildest dreams of ancestors in terms of taking our country forward. So go to shethepeople.org, sign up on our list, follow us on Twitter. That's my ask. You follow me on Twitter if you want, at Aimee Allison too. Let's stay in touch, because it's the beginning of a conversation I want to keep having. But I'm 50. I'm at a certain point of the work, and I want to help to encourage and uplift the questions and the work that you're doing. Second thing, Barbara Lee, who's the congresswoman, the congresswoman at Cal and my congresswoman in Oakland, is running the coordinated campaign to text and call into battleground states. I highly, highly recommend that you sign up for a shift or two at least, and communicate with and make sure that people vote in the states that are going to make the difference in November. And because the organizers we're not really going door to door, we're not holding big events. That's what I did in 2016. I'm not doing it now. Texting is actually really powerful, and you can contribute a lot, and you can focus. And Barbara Lee's lists focus on people of color. So you can go to Barbara Lee's campaign site and sign up. And then the third thing is, we have a lot of important issues on the ballot in California. If you are registered here, you have family here, please get everyone that you know to vote. And our ballot, our early voting starts 4 weeks before election day. So the first week of, so we're just 4 weeks away from now. So affirmative action, justice is on the ballot, taxation is on the ballot. There's a lot of very important state issues. And I really encourage you to make sure that everyone in your world absolutely votes and votes early. And that's my request. I just really thank you very, very much for having me on, listening to me opine about the work and giving me an opportunity to get some reflection, just, you know, right in advance of the most important election of our lives.
Well, quickly, can we get everybody to unmute themselves and offer Amy a round of applause?
Thank you, Amy. Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Much.
And I just want to
Thank
say,
you.
as
Thank
we talked
you.
about, that this is a fight that doesn't end in November. It keeps going. So get in touch with Amy and let's work together to push for everything that women of color and the whole country really needs, even post-November. Thank you, Amy, for joining us.